I work at the Darabont County Archives, Part 6C. Written by JenniKinoShimatta. We ate a great lunch at the Silverlode. Steak and potatoes were on Ken. Then we sat out on the lodge balcony while everyone smoked cigars that our esteemed financer had brought for the occasion. I could tell that Steve was having a lot of fun being part of the group. Then we looked for souvenirs and bought a case of bottled water to bring with us. We were taking a rented SUV to the sanitarium since the roads had stopped being roads sometime in the 1960s. The plan was to drive over. It was about 30 minutes from Skydale's main strip through the trees. We'd then poke around a bit and then come back in time for a late dinner. The sanitarium was supposedly no longer in use, and there was no security service keeping watch. No one offered tours or anything like that. It was widely considered public property, so there was the latent threat of drug addicts and squatters hidden in the shadows. Jamie, Cecily, Kitty, and Alex elected to stay at the lodge since the car wouldn't hold all of us. So we packed up and were off in no time. The drive through the forest was down an overgrown dirt path haphazardly cut through the trees. A couple of dilapidated yellow arrow signs, each riddled with buckshot, lazily directed us down a couple of forks until we got to a huge clearing. And then the imposing building appeared. Once beautiful grounds were weed-choked and barren. Old topiaries were monstrosities riddled with creeping vines that reminded me of the dog thing from John Carpenter's movie. And the roof of the closest wings had collapsed over time. It was hardly an auspicious beginning. The Esther Cavitt Sanitarium leans against the southern side of the Tallman a few miles parallel to Skydale's. It's a somewhat ramshackle building in the old style with a main building and 3 wings. 2 attached to either end of the main, and the last one is freestanding. It's built behind it into the mountainside. The main entrance is a stone and mortar affair looking more like a Tudor moorhouse, complete with what was once an oval gravel driveway that disappears into the trees leading to Skydale's and then to the main road. It sits on a peculiar area of land disputed between Fraser Lake and Skydale's. But since its abandonment in the 60s, that particular argument has faded. No one wants a brooding dead resort in their jurisdiction. Doing some digging with the help of Mr. Barry and Miss Angie, I was able to find out some of the history of the building, both the official and unofficial accounts. Ground was initially broken in 1893 for the foundation of what would eventually become the Esther Cavitt Sanitarium. But at the beginning it was christened the Wayland Goering Institute for Healthy Living. Construction would not be complete until the spring of 1895. David Wayland, a fairly well-known pulmonologist out of New York, had partnered with a psychiatrist out of Vienna named Frederick Goering. They had joined forces to build a tuberculosis resort in the crisp mountain air of Vermont. This was during the height of the tuberculosis epidemic, where doctors believed that fresh, cold, crisp air helped to cure the disease. Having seen and been recognized for his work on soldiers with tuberculosis during the Civil War, Wayland determined a link between infantry soldiers who inhaled cannon smoke and the advanced symptoms of the disease, falling neatly in line with the medical beliefs of the time. The Precipice Bay Lighthouse declared, "Famed physician opens institute to eradicate the scourge of consumption." The Wayland Goering Institute was a sanatorium mainly built to continue Wayland's treatments, but it was designed to Goering's specifications to test his theories on psychological and spatial comfort. The founders made a clear distinction between sanitarium and sanatorium that continued throughout the building's history. The institute was a sanatorium, a hospital built for the express purpose of medical care. It would eventually become a sanitarium, a pleasure resort with emphasis on healthy living. And yes, before we really get into it, Frederick Goering was unfortunately related to that Goering, he of Hitler's inner circle. But Frederick's work was of a far more wholesome and innocuous variety. He believed that open, bright places and positive environments would speed up recovery, and that psychological belief could assist the body in fighting disease. The Institute's wide roofs were flat and lined with white stone gravel for sunbathing and outdoor activities. Indoor conservatories took up the top floor of the entire building with enormous windows for those patients unable to be outside. According to local rumors, the Institute had two faces: the clean resort for the rich and famous, or rich and consumptive, and the darker labs run by a Frankensteinian madman hell-bent on human experimentation. As always, Miss Angie warns that many bastardizations have spread about Wayland and the Institute. But the main stories fall into three distinctive categories. The first being that Wayland was a sexual deviant. The second is that the Institute was a front for unethical government experimentation. And the third, that Wayland performed unnecessary surgery for his own amusement. And really, anything in between those has been gossiped around the county for years. Wayland was accused of unfounded advances by a pharmaceutical heiress. This information was buried at the bottom of page 7 of The Lighthouse, dated August 10th, 1898. But the heiress apparently retracted her accusation 2 days later. There was also a disturbing editorial published in the third 1899 issue of the Boston Medical and Surgical Journal by Wayland. It asserted that extensive surgery was the only true cure for TB, and that the apparatus were being developed, presumably by him, to replace the excised lung tissue. It ended with the radical statement that replacing the lungs of those afflicted was the only sure way to cure the condition. The article was widely lambasted for the next few issues of the journal. In February 1901, Wayland was detained by police in connection with an amputation that he'd performed on Timothy Springer. Springer was a guest at the Institute who had fallen during a hike and been knocked unconscious. When he awoke, he found that Wayland had amputated both of his legs below the knee due to compound fractures and blood loss. Springer believed that there was no way that his fall could have possibly shattered his legs enough to require amputation, and he loudly claimed that Wayland had flashbacks to the Civil War and amputated them unnecessarily. Aside from the police note stating that Wayland was taken in for questioning, that's where the story disappears. Miss Angie claims that Goering paid off Springer to shut down the suit. She might be right because Wayland effectively falls off the map after that. Goering continued the Institute. The rich and the famous still stayed, and it was profitable enough to pay for the road from Fraser Lake up the mountain to the Institute. But Wayland wasn't in the public eye anymore. He's still listed as chief medical officer in ads and leaflets, but he doesn't reappear in the papers until 1919 and the Bleak Hill Asylum riot. More on this later. The main instigator of the riot was Ferbal Cuttle. He was a known lunatic who had been in the asylum for about a week before the riot. The riot resulted in 47 inmate deaths, the deaths of 8 guards, and enough injuries that the asylum was temporarily shut down. The warden of Bleak Hill took it upon himself to ask Goering's opinion on Ferber's condition. Needless to say, nothing after that went well. Wayland declared that Ferber's insanity was caused by the vagaries of natural malady synthesized into a single ifrit of madness. It can be dispelled with modern scientific technology and knowledge. Considering the chaos Ferber caused in only 6 short days at Bleak Hill, he was quickly and permanently transferred to the institute under Wayland's care. Neither patient nor physician would be mentioned again until 1922, when the authorities responded to a fire at the institute. It must be noted that from 1919 through 1922, business at the institute took the mother of all nosedives. Miss Angie says that it was Goering who set the fire to recoup some of the losses, but that he couldn't know how bad the fire would get out of control. Thankfully, that nosedive meant that there were only 12 guests at the time of the fire, but only 2 were alive when the fire began. When the fire was finally put out, the full horror of the situation was finally revealed. Ferber and Wayland were found in a secret room in the institute's extensive basement, which was, coincidentally, completely missing from the blueprints. They were burned to cinders. Ferber was lashed to a steel bed frame, and Wayland was curled into a fetal position underneath it. Another room was where the searchers found 10 of the final guests, also burned but clearly having undergone a variety of creative surgical procedures. The Lighthouse and the Hollows Gazette both were thin on details, but Miss Angie claims that each victim was, as she'd heard it, hollowed out. Missing intestines, lungs, other organs, bones, and limbs. The victims' families sued Wayland's estate and went after Goering, but nothing stuck to the Austrian immigrant who quickly fled back to Europe, just in time to die at the beginning of World War II. The building fell into disrepair, and no one wanted anything to do with such a cursed spot. That is, until a group of entrepreneurial gentlemen purchased the land for 3% its worth and decided that it was the perfect place to build a resort. The Esther Cavitt Sanitarium opened in 1928 to no fanfare and even less media coverage. Rebuilt to maintain the basic structures, the redesign included lush topiary gardens, 4 tennis courts, an outdoor pool, and a polo field. It was advertised only to the rich and famous for a healthy respite from the bustles of day-to-day life in the city. There was a wellspring of these types of places in the 20s and 30s. Vacation resorts ostensibly built for convalescents, but really retreats for the rich to eat and play and, well, get up to carnal fun. The sanitarium was named after one of the victims of Wayland's madness, presumably to honor the memory of what happened, but it was really just in poor taste. The sanitarium was open from the spring of 1928 to the fall of 1934. There's not much information about it in the archives, but, as always, Miss Angie has some stories to tell. The big movers and shakers of the time used places like the sanitarium for their games out of the public eye. Places like Esther Cavitt guaranteed absolute secrecy and discretion so playboys and perverted old millionaires used them for orgies, mistresses, etc. Miss Angie could only give me one story that had anything verifiable from the newspaper morgue. On Wednesday, July 9th, 1933, the Darabont County Sheriff's Department responded to a call from the Esther Cavitt Sanitarium reporting a dead woman. The woman was a known prostitute from New Stickney and Brinksfield. She was named Sarah Gasparo, age 27. She was found in an empty room in an unused wing of the resort, naked, covered in blood and semen. I was able to pull the coroner's report, and it states that the cause of death was sepsis and blood loss due to a perforated bowel. She had been exposed to the elements during and/or following her death, and there was some argument upon discovery as to whether her body was frozen from cold or rigor mortis. No one at the sanitarium had seen her and informed the sheriff's department that she was found in a wing of the resort that was not in use, and thus was not patrolled by security. As even summer nights can get cold high up in the mountains, it was ruled that she broke into the room after an altercation at a different location and expired without medical care. Nothing else was in the coroner's report, aside from the cause of death and minimal autopsy results. But one of the key points was an estimate that she had been dead for at least 48 hours. Now, I hope that you've come to the same conclusion. Sarah Gasparo was hired to entertain a guest of the resort. Obviously, something went wrong, and when it was clear that she was on her way out, the staff shuffled her into the unused wing. They waited until she was dead, then waited some more, and then finally called the sheriff. The sanitarium staff obviously did their job well, since there was a one-line death notice buried in the middle of the obituaries of the Fraser Lake crier, and everyone went on with their lives. Miss Angie warned me that a lot of the stories were full of window dressing about satanic cults and orgies, but that it was all utter hogwash. She also said that Sarah's death had been bastardized over the decades with such salacious details as her stomach was filled with semen, that her genitalia were mutilated in the manner of Jack the Ripper, or that the cause of her perforated bowel was due to being buggered with a knife. She specifically used air quotes for that last bit. For Miss Angie, Sarah's death was a tragedy caused by rough play by one of the sanitarium's guests. But there wasn't anything satanic or supernatural about it. The rich and famous always have some dark secret in their closets, she said. It just so happened that Sarah was too big for the closet. Soon after, the sanitarium closed its doors fully. Rationing and the war preparations made it impossible for the resort to stay afloat, no matter how many fat cats and captains of industry were willing to spend thousands to stay there. And so the building sat vacant, and Skydales was born to fill the void for filthy rich entertainment. Now, both Steve and Miss Angie say that there were stories, hearsay and the like, that the government had a secret lab at the sanitarium in the 50s and 60s. These stories fed into the tales of UFOs and Bigfoot in the area. But I wasn't able to find anything verifiable. No witnesses, no photographs. So, officially, the sanitarium closed in 1934 and has laid silent and unused up to the present day. Given all this history, you'd expect that the place would have been overrun with ghost and paranormal occurrences. But I've got to burst your bubble. We didn't see anything. The place was eerie, don't get me wrong, but we didn't see or hear anything. We took tons of EVP readings, but for obvious reasons, we don't know if we have anything yet. There were no doors that we could see anywhere. We came in the entranceway under the stone portcullis and were immediately assaulted by the stink of rot and mildew. A pile of miscellaneous garbage and broken furniture blocked the two stairways leading up, forcing us down a wide hall covered in graffiti to the main ward. A huge mass of burned stuff, it was impossible to identify the individual items in the charred pile, dominated the large room, and the concrete walls were covered in a thick patina of smoke and spray paint. There were broken needles, bottles, and various drug paraphernalia that were strewn in the corners and soiled camping equipment laid in haphazard heaps around the bonfire. Thankfully, there weren't any indications that the users of any of this equipment were around. From the main hall, we decided to separate and went up the two clear stairways up to the upper floor. Ken, Alice, Downey, and I took the stairs to the far right, and Steve, Jimmy, Terry, and Meg took the steps on the left. The stench of urine and feces was overpowering in the stairwell, and we quickly covered our mouths and noses with our clothes. It seemed like the residents of the building used the stairs going down to the basement as a communal toilet. It was about as disgusting as you can imagine. With the path down literally blocked by crap, we decided to go up. The second floor was a wide corridor lined with doors leading across the building to the opposite staircase. Once again, every door was missing. I'm assuming that they were taken down and used in the bonfire. So it was clear as we moved across that most were offices. Ken was using the EMF meter while Downey filmed and Alice and I used voice recorders. It was slow going and more than a little tedious. It seemed obvious that whatever dark things happened at Esther Cavitt hadn't created a lasting effect. Sure, the building itself was creepy, but in the same way that a disused and unlit underground walkway was creepy. It was dark, graffitied within an inch of its life, and littered with trash and crap, liberally covering the walls. But it was all surface and nothing underneath. To put it into perspective, the claustrophobic, permeating darkness that I'd felt in The Point was entirely missing from the sanitarium walls. Sunlight filtered dimly into the building from all the broken windows, and the occasional breeze brought gusts of sweet-smelling air through the empty rooms, unlike the choking darkness of the forest. Everything we were doing seemed so perfunctory. I think that even Ken felt it. There just wasn't anything scary about the old building. The stairs going up to the roof were blocked on one end and missing on the other, so we returned to the main ward. While we waited for the other 4 members of our group to return, Downey and Ken poked around the nurse's station. It wasn't that long of a wait. It seemed like the basement access in the left staircase was clear and free from all bodily excretions, at least enough for them to get down. But there was another mountain of furniture blocking the underground hall. They did EVP recordings and EMF sweeps, but just like us, there wasn't even a blip. Out of idle curiosity, we decided to all take a look, and soon enough it became clear that the barrier was insurmountable. Plywood fragments, chairs, metal desks, seemingly everything that the constructors could get their hands on and move without equipment was crammed from one side of the corridor to the other, and from floor to ceiling. It was actually impressive, but also somewhat worrying. I mean, if the squatters took down every door to burn for warmth, why would they waste any wooden furniture on such an edifice? Since the way was further blocked and none of us wanted to wade through the toilet in the opposite stairwell, we put it up as a botched job and headed back to the car. I think the fact that we were running behind schedule adversely affected our experiences at the sanitarium. Don't get me wrong, some seriously messed up stuff happened there, both on and off the books, so to speak. But we just weren't feeling it. Whatever happened didn't seem to leave anything behind. Maybe the lingering dread of The Point means it really was something supernatural that disappeared the children. And the reason that nothing feels wrong at Esther Cavitt is just because the cause wasn't supernatural. Not that I'm giving any credence to the story of the witch, but crazy people doing crazy things doesn't have to have a supernatural reason. That's just people. Yeah, I think the fact that we only had a few hours to get there, poke around, and get back before dark seriously impeded our experience. There wasn't any power there, and we weren't going to drive the van with all the equipment up along with generators if we weren't going to spend significant amounts of time investigating. Unfortunately, we were still paying for our drunken first night together. But despite that, I have high hopes for our next stop, Whole Bar in Cold Spring, our first overnight ghost hunt. Stay tuned for that update.